Now let's pick up Plato. 427 to 347 BC. One of Socrates' disciples, as I said. He wrote a great deal. A lot of it is lost to us. What we have is primarily, aside from some letters, a series of dialogues, 20-odd dialogues. He wrote in that form in order to reproduce and perpetuate the conversational method of his master. You know, of course, that Plato founded the first university of the Western world, the Academy, and therefore his followers were frequently called in the ancient world the academics from Academy. Its motto was supposed to be emblazoned over the doors of it, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here," which can suggest to you already the influence of Pythagoras on Plato. His major work in terms of popular and known by just about everybody is the Republic. Now, Plato, to do him credit in advance, is undoubtedly one of the two most influential philosophers of all time, the other being Aristotle. He is the first great philosophic genius in human history. And I say that deliberately and advisedly, not from the perspective of the truth of his ideas or even the rationality of them, because objectivism disagrees entirely with Platonism, with its conclusions and its approach. But he is nevertheless one of the greatest geniuses philosophically in three ways: in his abstract ability, which was superlatively greater than everyone else in the history of thought but for Aristotle; in his originality, he was the man essentially who created philosophy from the tentative bits and suggestions that I've given you so far; and in his power of systematic integration. He was the first to put it all together into a comprehensive view of man, of reality, of knowledge, of life, of ethics, of politics, of art. And this is an achievement not to be underestimated. Now, Plato was in complete agreement with Socrates' view that the crucial knowledge needed for man was a knowledge of universals. He himself, however, drew metaphysical conclusions from this that Socrates, as far as we can tell, did not. Now, I want to follow Plato here step by step because this is the most crucial part of his philosophy. It's the basis of his distinctive, world-famous, staggeringly influential metaphysics. Well, we start with the premise then that universals must be knowable. Otherwise, we're going to be back in the position of the animals and the sophists. Well, if universals must be knowable, we can conclude one thing right away: they must actually exist. They must be real. Because Parmenides has made it perfectly clear that thou canst not know what is not. And therefore, if universals are real, are knowable, they must be real. They must exist. Which raises the question, where do they exist? How do they exist? Now, for Plato, this is a grave problem. It was later called, for perfectly obvious reasons, the problem of universals. Now, you might say in advance, you don't see any problem. And since I have to get you to see a problem to understand Plato, let me tell you what is probably on your mind. You probably think like this. You say universals exist in particulars. Manness, you would say, for instance, is merely a name for all the similar characteristics possessed by individual men. You would say, of course, manness is not something over and above individual men, as though you have Tom, Dick, and Harry, etc., and then another one called manness. And so you say, where's the problem? When you're thinking about universals, you are really thinking about particulars from a certain point of view. Now, Plato says no. This is wrong. Not true. He is proposing to argue that universals and particulars have radically different characteristics and therefore must, in logic, be radically different kinds of things. Universals cannot simply be names for aspects of particulars. That's what he's going to argue for. But his method here is like this. How do you know that Smith and Jones are two different people? Suppose somebody said Smith is just a name for parts of Jones. You'd say, well, look, I know that Smith and Jones are two different people because Smith is a plumber, Jones is a philosopher. Smith is rich, Jones is poor, etc. Make a list of all the different characteristics, and you say they have to be two different, completely different entities because they have completely opposite characteristics. Well, Plato proposes to do exactly that with universals and particulars. He's going to find a whole list of differences, complete opposites, on every count, and he's going to say how, therefore, could universals possibly be a name for groups of particulars when they're completely opposite? There must then be two worlds, is the conclusion we're going to come to. A world which has the characteristics of particulars, and another one which has the characteristics of universals. Well, how do these differ? How do universals and particulars differ? And there are 4 points, at least, that Plato makes. To begin with, remember the Greeks were fascinated with multiplicity. So let's look at the question from the point of view of multiplicity, of the one and the many. How many particulars are there in a given class? How many men, for instance? Well, obviously millions. And if we don't bother to quantify, we'll call them just many. How many universals are there in that class? How many mannesses? Well, says Plato, obviously, one. How many triangles? Particular triangles. Endless number. Many. How many triangularities? Obviously, only one. Suppose you proved a theorem about triangularity, about all triangles, in other words, and somebody said to you, well, that's true of this triangularity, but it's not true of that one. You would look at him baffled and say, what do you mean? There aren't two triangularities. There's only one. The universal is what's common to all the different particulars. It is the unifying common denominator. It is, if we hark back to the early phrase, the one in the many. So you can put down on your list, under universals, one per category. Under particulars, many. Now we go on to the next point. The Greeks were not only fascinated with multiplicity, but with change. What about the contrast between universals and particulars from the point of view of change? Well, says Plato, particulars are obviously changing. They come into existence, they hang around for a while, they decay, they grow old, they rot, and they pass out of existence. In fact, he believes with Heraclitus that particulars are changing all the time in every respect at every instant. That this world is a stream of Heraclitean flux. He agrees with Heraclitus, having learned that through Cratylus. But universals, he says, are unchanging. They are eternal, indestructible, immutable. Well, how does he defend that? Well, think of the idea of manness, or the idea of triangularity, or any one that you want. We are able to formulate unvarying laws. We can say man requires self-esteem by the very nature of man. And this is an immutable law. Now, how would that be possible unless manness, the thing the law is about, were immutable, unless it were unchanging? Or we can say triangles must have an angle sum of 180 degrees. How is that possible unless, as an immutable law, unless there's such a thing as immutable triangularity, and so on. Therefore, when we think of a universal, says Plato, we're not thinking of particulars, because particulars change in every aspect. But universals go on unchanged. That's point 2. And now point 3. Think of it from the point of view of the constitution of the two. Particulars are primarily material or physical. Animals can see them, hear them, taste them. But what about universals? Are they accessible to animals? Can you see manness or boneness? Obviously not. The dog can see bones, but it can't see boneness. So boneness is somehow abstract. It's non-physical. And that's proved by the fact that we can grasp it by the senses. So we have another contrast. Something non-physical, that's universals. Something physical, that's particulars. And fourthly, as a consequence of that, how do we know the two different things? Particulars, by means of our senses. Universals, not by means of the senses, but the mind, the reason, the intelligence, the thinking capacity, the intellect. Well, says Plato, the conclusion to draw is inescapable. How can we deny that there are two different worlds? On the one hand, a world in which there is one universal per category, unchanging, non-material, knowable only by the mind, and the other, a world of multiple changing physical sensory particulars. They're not the same. One can't be explained as simply a name for the other. And yet we know that universals must exist. They must be real. Conclusion, there must be two worlds. There must be two realms, the world of universals and the world of particulars, QED. That's argument one. Now, there are many arguments for this metaphysics in Plato. If you want to give them names, that's names that I made up, but they'd be helpful if you're taking notes. You can call this first one the argument from the differences between universals and particulars. Now, there are a legion of arguments in Plato. I'll give you three more. Different arguments, all leading to the same conclusion from different aspects. You can call the second one, I'm giving you these not in Plato's order, but just in the order that it's most convenient for exposition. Call the second one the argument from perfection. And this one begins, where do we get our concepts and standards of perfection? In any category. Now, Plato primarily uses mathematical and ethical examples here, like the perfect triangle or the perfectly just man, but it applies to any category. A perfect straight line, a perfect government, a perfect banana, a perfect inner spring mattress, you name it. Where do we get our concepts of perfection from? Well, you might say by seeing individual perfect instances and then abstracting. Plato says, no, you could not have got your concept of perfection by this means because nothing in this world is perfect. Nothing in this world is perfect. A fundamental principle of Plato's philosophy. There is no such thing as perfection in this world. Why not? Well, he says that's proved by the fact that things in this world change. If a thing changes, it couldn't be perfect, because if it was perfect, it would simply stand still. It would lack nothing. Take, for instance, a man. Suppose a man was perfect. He lacked nothing. He's completely perfect. Well, then he wouldn't have to eat. He doesn't lack food. He wouldn't have to go to school. He doesn't lack knowledge. He wouldn't have to breathe. He doesn't lack air. He'd simply be the way the Christian Jewish God is supposed to be. He'd just sit there motionless because he's already perfect, you see. On the other hand, if things change, that means they lack something. They're imperfect. They have to grow and develop, etc. They are not perfect. Even in mathematics, the Platonists say you'll never find perfection. Now you know the standard example. Did you ever see a perfect straight line? And a Platonist will say no. If you look at the most beautiful straight line through a microscope, you see little wiggles. So it's not perfectly straight. And even as aside from that, the Platonists will say you've never actually seen a perfect triangle. In fact, they'll go further. You've never even seen a triangle of any kind. Now, if I put on the blackboard, if we had one here, a triangle, you'd say, isn't that a triangle? And the Platonists would say, no, it is not. A triangle is defined as a plane figure bounded by three straight lines. Now, what I have on the board is not a line. A line is simply extension in one dimension. It's a three-dimensional phenomenon. It comes out from the board a certain distance, and it has a certain thickness. So if it was to be simply a line, which is how a triangle is defined, we'd have to erase the chalk from the board to get rid of the thickness, and we'd have to erase the width of it, and of course we'd have left nothing. In other words, we don't have not only a perfect triangle, we don't even have a triangle. What we have is a crude approximation of a triangle, which is not a sensory phenomenon, according to Plato. So, if you can't get it in mathematics, you can't get it anywhere. But what do we then conclude? We must have got our concepts of perfection from somewhere, because we have those concepts. We criticize things as imperfect, and the fact that we say something is imperfect presupposes that we know in some way what would perfection consist of. So we have a knowledge of what perfection consists of, and yet we couldn't have got it from this world. Well then, from where? Well, Plato says we must have got it from contemplating another world. A world which contains the perfect embodiment of everything in this world. A world of perfect archetypes or universals. Now notice that whenever we think of a universal, or at least typically, you usually have a perfect, unblemished representative in mind. If I say think of man, well, to most of you at least, John Galt will come to mind and not some welfare recipient. If you say university, with all due allowances for deterioration, you probably think of Harvard and not of a teacher's college in Tennessee. If you say the human body, well, you think of an Olympic athlete and not some broken down Hulk, etc. So the association between the universal and the perfect is very firm, very strong, and Plato cashes in on it to conclude that the world of perfection that we need is precisely the world of universals. And he concludes, therefore, there must be a world of perfect universals, which we have contemplated at some time prior to this life, thereby gaining our standards and knowledge of perfection, and thereby, by contrast, being able to say that the things in this world are imperfect. Now notice, therefore, we've not only established by this particular argument the world of universals, but two other things. We've established innate ideas, knowledge possessed in us at birth, because we had to be born with this knowledge of perfection. Since we have it, and as he claims to have proved, we couldn't have acquired it during this life. So it had to come from another world, and that means we had to have knowledge at birth. So we've laid the first groundwork for the theory of innate ideas in epistemology. And in regard to another point, we've proved that the soul must be independent of the body, because the soul must have been in this other world apart from and prior to the formation of the body. And therefore, we've laid the groundwork to establish the immortality of the soul. So this argument brings in a whole bunch of Platonic themes. All right, let's turn to argument 3, which I call the argument from the order of knowledge. And it takes off from the question, which in logic would you have to learn first? Would you have to know first? Universals or particulars? Now you might think, well, first you know particulars and then you arrive at universals by abstraction from what they have in common. Plato says absolutely wrong. He says it's impossible to know particulars, to classify them, to categorize them, unless you knew universals in advance. And he goes into an elaborate criticism of the theory that you arrive at universals by a process of abstraction. Now, the advocate of abstraction, which is essentially the Aristotelian view, says the way you arrive at particulars, and I'll give Aristotle perfectly good hearing when we get to him, but for now, I'm doing my best by Plato. The advocate of the view that you arrive at universals by abstraction from particulars says, if you want to define justice, for instance, or arrive at a knowledge of justice in general, the way to do it is collect before your mind all the particular instances of justice, or at least a great many, and then abstract and see what they have in common. To which Plato says this is an impossible thing to do, because if you didn't know what justice was in advance, how would you know what was a particular instance of it? How would you know what things to collect together and perform the abstraction from? How would you know what particulars to group together? Now, says Plato, we have a real tricky question here. To define a universal, we have to assemble the instances before us. For instance, in the case of justice, and then grasp what's common. But we're in this position. If we knew in advance what was common, if we already knew, we would never have to inquire, because we know all definitions in advance. If we don't know in advance, then we have no idea how to inquire, because we don't know what particulars to collect or group together. Suppose I told you, go out and find the definition of gloop. And you say, how? I say, find all the particular gloops and then abstract what they have in common. Say, that's ridiculous. I don't know what to look for. So Plato says we're in this paradoxical position. Somehow we have to know universals in advance to be able to organize particulars. And yet we don't know them in advance, otherwise we would simply be able, if we did, we'd simply be able to whip off the answers, and we obviously don't. We have to know and not know. And how is that possible? Well, he says there's only one solution. There must again be a realm of universals, independent of this world, which we knew before this life. Of course, here he's relying on the Pythagorean wheel of birth reincarnation idea. It must be the case that we were born with innate knowledge of all these universals. So in a certain sense, we're born omniscient. We know every category and all the relationships, which means all the laws. And in that sense, we do have all knowledge. But the knowledge in it is unconscious when we're born. It's deep in our subconscious, to use modern terms. And you have to go through a special process, which I'll tell you about next week, to unearth it. And therefore, in a sense, yes, we are born with it, in the sense that we have it. But in a sense, no, we're not. We have to unearth it by a deliberate process. In any event, the point is proved. There must be a world of universals, and we must have had knowledge of it in some form prior to this life. Otherwise, we would simply gape like animals at particulars and have no idea how to proceed. And now the last argument that I'll look at. The argument from the possibility of knowledge. Knowledge must be possible. Knowledge of reality. That's Plato's basic premise. And the question, therefore, is, what must reality be like if knowledge is to be possible? And here he simply draws the final conclusions of all his predecessors. Heraclitus had said you cannot know a world that's changing, or rather Heraclitus' followers like Cratylus had said you can't know a world of flux. But this world is a world of flux. Plato says, true enough. Therefore, if reality is to be knowable, it must be immutable. That means another world. Heraclitus and Parmenides had both said if a world is changing, then it's contradictory. And you can't know the contradictory because it is and it isn't. And Plato says, true enough, if a world is to be knowable, it must be made of consistent entities. And that means entities which don't change, given that he accepts Parmenides and Heraclitus, and therefore, again, an immutable other world. The sophists had said, knowledge acquired by the senses is invalid. It's subjective. It's not of reality. Plato agrees. Therefore, he says, if we are to have knowledge of reality, it must be knowledge that's acquired by a non-sensory means. And if it's acquired by a non-sensory means, it must be of a non-material object, because material objects could be known in theory by the senses. And if this has to be the kind of world that's inaccessible to the senses, it must be non-material. Socrates had said the crucial thing to know is universals. And universals happen to have all the characteristics that the world that's knowable has to have. They're immutable, self-consistent, motionless, non-material. The conclusion must therefore be, if there's to be knowledge of reality at all, if that's to be possible, it must be of a world of universals, not of this world. And therefore, you see, Pythagoreanism wins out in Plato. There is two worlds. Knowledge, true knowledge, is knowledge of the other world. Only now it's not the world of numbers, but numbers are just one small constituent. It's the world of universals, which include numbers and everything else that has any instances actual or possible. I may say in his very late life, there's reason to believe that Plato himself reverted to pure Pythagoreanism and converted the universals back into numbers. But that is not what he is famous for. So we'll treat him as a Platonist. I mean, as that's understood. So Plato thought he had the final answer to all the problems of the skeptics. The Heracliteans had said, this world is a world of flux and we can't speak or acquire knowledge of it. Plato said, true enough, but there is an immutable, knowable world, the world of universals. The Heraclitean, it says, this world is contradictory and constantly, because it's constantly changing. Plato said, true enough, but there is a non-contradictory reality, the motionless world of universals. The Heraclitean sophists said, we can't rely on the senses, and Plato said, true. but there's a non-material world we can know by non-sensory means. A supernatural realm of universals. This is Plato's solution to the problems of earlier philosophy. There are therefore two worlds. The world of universals, also given a variety of names, sometimes called the world of essences, which we in this course will use as synonymous with universal. It's frequently called the world of forms with a capital F. It's frequently called the world of ideas, Platonic ideas with a capital I. It's frequently called the intelligible world because it's the world that you grasp by intelligence, by the mind. And as against that, there's the world of particulars, or the physical world, or the sensible world, as it's called, that being the world you grasp by the senses. Now here is a kind of full-fledged overview description of the differences between the two worlds. The first thing to grasp is that universals for Plato are entirely different from two things. They're entirely different from the particulars in this world. They're independent of the particulars in this world. And they are independent of our thoughts. If you wiped out all of our thoughts about madness, that would not touch madness. Madness is real and immutable. Whether we think of it or not has no effect on it. Indeed, if we wiped out all particular men, that would not touch madness. Madness is immutable. It's eternal. It's indestructible. And therefore, universals are to be thought of for Plato as not thoughts and not particulars, but actual entities, things, real external objects. Only, of course, they're not physical. But they are nevertheless, in his view, real. And that's why, although Plato's word for them is a Greek word idea, it's very common not to call them the world of ideas, because idea to us suggests a thought in somebody's mind. And that's why most people translate the actual word idea into the word form, which has the virtue of being entirely meaningless, and therefore doesn't mislead people into thinking that Plato's ideas are ideas in a mind. They are free-floating universals. Up there is subway hood and banana splitness and you name it. Now, there are no banana splits. It's not sensory. It's the essence of banana split as such. Whereas down here, of course, there are particular individual things. How many of them? Well, for every class of particulars, there is a corresponding universal. For every abstract word that we use, and undoubtedly for a great many that we haven't yet discovered. There is one such to every group of many in this world. Universals are unchanging, immutable, eternal. Particulars are changing, temporal, Heraclitean. Universals are perfect. Particulars are imperfect. They simply approximate the perfection of the forms. Universals are non-material. Now, I should point out they are also non-mental, because minds are also particulars. Your mind, her mind, his mind. What's up there is not a particular mind, but mindness, the universal that's common to all minds. And therefore, universals are neither mental nor physical. They're simply universals. Whereas the things down here, if we leave aside minds, are essentially material. Universals are knowable by thought, particulars only by the senses. But particulars are not really knowable, according to Plato, because down here, in this world, all you can have is subjective opinions. There he agrees with Heraclitus and the Sophists. True knowledge is always knowledge of the forms, of the ideas, never of the particulars in this world. Now, of these two worlds, which do you think Plato regarded as really real? Well, obviously the world of forms. That's reality. Now, why? Well, for a number of reasons. Ask yourself, what does it mean to say that something is real? What are the tests, so to speak, of reality? Well, Plato gives a number of tests, and on every test, the world of forms comes out with flying colors, and the world in which we live fails miserably. Here are 4 such tests, for instance. To be real, a thing has to exist. Now, for instance, you say Santa Claus isn't real. He doesn't exist. But follow that out. For a thing to exist, it can't be contradictory, says Plato, which is true. But for a thing to be non-contradictory, it has to be motionless. That's the Heraclitean view, because change involves a contradiction. What can we say about the things in this world then? Are they real? Well, they're contradictory, which means they are and they are not. They are somehow, says Plato, a union of what is and what isn't. They are being and non-being. They are therefore not real. They are partly illusory, kind of, they have about the status of a dream. It's there, but it isn't. It is and it isn't. For Plato, the real must therefore be the immutable. That's test one. Or again, we can use the test that a thing is real when it's knowable. Plato held very firmly the view that reality is that which is the object of knowledge. And as we've seen, if knowledge is of reality, and knowledge is only of the world of forms, then the world of forms is reality, not this world. And then by a third test, Plato equated the real with the perfect, with the ideal. And this is a usage of the word real which has survived to this day. You serve somebody a piece of apple pie and he says, that's real apple pie. Or you say about him, he's a real man. Or there used to be a newspaper that said the paper for real New Yorkers. Now they obviously didn't mean as opposed to hallucinatory New Yorkers. They mean good by real. And that usage is firmly accepted by Plato, so on that count also, the equation of the real with the ideal, the world of forms comes out as reality. And finally, we characteristically use the word real to stand for the original as against simply the imitations. Now, for instance, the other night somebody said to me, when I was complimenting, what is that product called? Potato buds, the form of instant mashed potatoes. Somebody said to me, oh, they're not real. That isn't really mashed potatoes. Now, they didn't mean that it was hallucinatory or non-existent, or even that it didn't taste good. They mean this isn't real, original, natural mashed potatoes. This is just an imitation. Well, on that test also, the world of forms is the original. It's the independent. The world in which we live is just an imitation, derivative, or projection of the world of forms. So on that count of originality also, the world of forms emerges as reality. What then is the status of this world in which we live? Well, says Plato, it is like a byproduct or a derivative or a projection or a reflection of true reality. Now, if you want a metaphor, which is simply a metaphor, but it's one that I've used for years as my own, not Plato's, but it makes it as clear as I think you can. You have to project standing in an amusement park and looking into one of those distorted amusement park mirrors. Now, in this simile or analogy, you represent the world of forms. And the distorted, twisted, garish reflection of you represents the imperfect image of you projected into the mirror. Now, to make it a proper parallel, we have to assume that the mirror is multifaceted, so that where there's one of you, there's a whole variety of images. And an ignorant person looking at them might confuse it and think there's many different people, but there's actually only one. It's just that the image is splintered. And now we have to imagine someone there with a crank whirling these facets around, so that the images seem to be racing around even though you are standing motionless. Now, that is approximately Plato's view of this world. Up there in the Platonic heaven is the single, motionless, perfect, non-material reality. But it projects itself outward and assumes the illusory appearance of a world of imperfect, multiple, moving images. And that world is the world we're living in temporarily. Now, Plato, of course, does not use the example of a mirror. He does say that this world is the world of forms reflected or projected into a medium, but not into a physical mirror. Well, what does he think that the world of forms projects into? Well, this is a fairly technical point from Plato, but just to satisfy your curiosity, if you have it, I'll mention that in one of his later dialogues, the Timaeus, he reasons as follows. He says that this world, we know from Heraclitus, must be a union of what is and what isn't. It must somehow be a union of reality and unreality. And this world in which we live must therefore be a compound. The forms, we know, represent the element of reality. But what represents the element of unreality that is part of, an essential part of this world? We need a nothing, a what is not, which sort of is, though, see. Because if it's just plain ordinary garden variety nothing, then we have left only the forms again, and we didn't get this world into existence. So this world, according to Plato, has to arise from a union of the forms with a principle of non-being which somehow is. Now that's a big problem. What could it be? The nothing which is, sort of. Well, Plato took his cue here from the atomists. The answer is empty space. Space, according to Plato, is nothing. And yet it exists. It is. Empty space now. It exists. It is therefore, in effect, the stand-in for the mirror, in my example. It is the actual medium which enables the forms to take on physical location. Not the forms themselves, but their images. And of course, space being extended in 3 dimensions, being spread out, it's suitable to be that element which gives material, physical character to the non-material forms. And therefore, this world is really the forms shining out into empty space. That's Plato's final theory of the relation between the two worlds. Therefore, if we took away empty space and wiped out this world, the forms would go on untouched. But if we did anything to the forms, this world would vanish in the same way as the image in the mirror would if you went away. But you don't have to worry about that happening because the forms are by their nature immutable and nothing can happen to them. Now, as to how this world came about, Plato, being a Greek, did not believe it was created ex nihilo, out of nothing. He believed that the stuff of the world always existed. The forms were always projecting into space, and therefore matter in a primitive form always existed. But he tells a story which is the forerunner of many religious views, the story so-called of the Demiurge. This is another myth. Whenever Plato tells a myth, it means take it seriously but not literally. It means he's trying to say something which he doesn't know how to say, but he means it, but not literally. Now, the myth of the Demiurge, D-E-M-I-U-R-G-E, is as follows. The Demiurge is a sort of godlike but very limited soul that wanders free in the universe. Not a form and not matter, kind of a third category. Sort of like a god, but nothing like the Christian God. Well, this Demiurge wandered by one day and saw all this chaotic matter. And being good, he said to himself, isn't there some way I could organize things better? So with one eye on the perfection of the world of forms, he shaped and organized the matter, molded it like an architect to produce as much order, harmony, symmetry, and perfection as he could. And that was the actual source of the lawfulness and the order of the world which we observe. This is the most primitive form of what later became the argument from design for the existence of God. That is, the world is so orderly, it must have had an orderer, a designer. And this is the earliest, one of the earliest. There were some pre-Socratics who anticipated Plato, but the most influential early version of that argument. In any event, Plato is insistent that the Demiurge was not all-powerful. He did as good as he could, but remember, this world had a very recalcitrant element in its constitution, and that is nothing, see. And that element, positively, you can't do anything with. It simply is deficient. And consequently, there was a certain imperfection had to remain in this world that is beyond anyone's power, and that's the reason why the world is imperfect. It's imperfect because it's partly not here. Now you know the basis and the essence of Plato's metaphysics. Now there's more to say about Plato's metaphysics, because I haven't yet brought in Plato's God, or to be exact, the ancestor of what later became the God of Christianity. It wasn't the Demiurge. He just appears in one dialogue and he's out. He never comes back again. What it was, well, I can't tell you, because to know that, we have to leave this world and embark on an excursion into the world of forms. in order to discover its content in greater detail. Now, as to the climax of Plato's metaphysics, I promised you that we would begin with an excursion into the world of forms to find out something about its content and structure. Well, the otherworldly trip is about to begin. Let us now leave this world and ascend to the world of forms for a few minutes and find out something about the characteristics of true reality. The first thing to know is that the forms, according to Plato, are not a disconnected grab bag of universals. It's not as though you simply have a motley collection of bananas, subway hood, justice, etc., without interrelationships. The fact is, the forms are all logically related to each other by various logical relationships. They are bound together into one integrated system. And indeed, says Plato, every scientific law, every mathematical theorem is merely a statement of how certain specific forms are logically interconnected. If I say, for instance, the sum of the angles of a triangle are 180 degrees, that is not a statement about any one particular triangle. It is a statement about triangularity, triangularity as such. And it says that triangularity as such is intrinsically connected with a 180-degree hood. That is a logical tie that's unavoidable. Or if I say all men are mortal, again, I am talking about man as such, and I am saying manness by its very nature entails mortality as such. And so for any universal law or principle we can state. Sciences, therefore, are really, for Plato, attempts to discover the structure of the world of forms. Attempts to show the order or organization or connection uniting the various forms. How do the sciences do it? Well, each science, says Plato, starts with certain basic premises. Certain basic statements of how the forms in its particular field are related. And it then proceeds to deduce a whole host of consequences from these basic premises. Each science, in this sense, is a description of the structure of some part of the world of forms. This is obvious in the case of mathematics. It starts with certain premises and then deduces its consequence. It's true of ethics. You must start somewhere with some basic premises and then deduce your whole system. It's true of physics. Whatever theory of physics you have, it begins somewhere with your physical axioms and then deduces the consequences. In other words, every individual science assumes certain relationships among certain forms and then deduces the consequences. Now, says Plato, this poses a problem. And that is that unless we can validate the basic premises in each science, all our knowledge remains hypothetical. All of our science is reduced to the level of assumption. It's on the order, if the premises are true, then everything we deduce from it is true, but how do we know the premises are true? We need in each field, therefore, true axioms, which means, says Plato, we need some foundation point from which we can deduce the axioms of the various individual sciences. Now, he says, in effect, just imagine that you could find one fundamental form, one, which was such that it was self-intelligible or self-luminous. In other words, you need no explanation of it, you need no proof of it. Once you grasp it, once you simply mentally come in contact with it, by that act you understand what it is and why it must exist. And now suppose, says Plato, that having grasped this one form, we could see that absolutely everything else followed from it. We could deduce from it all of the axioms of all of the individual sciences. Well, says Plato, if we could do that, we would have put every science on absolutely firm ground. And in addition, we would have achieved a marvelous result of intellectual unity. Instead of having psychologists talk their language, and moralists talk theirs, and physicists talk theirs, all in a splintered, unconnected, disintegrated, and often contradictory form, we would have tied all the areas of human knowledge together into one whole by deducing the basis of each separate science from one fundamental principle. We would, after all, says Plato, we live in one integrated universe. There must therefore be one ultimate principle from which everything else follows. Well, of course, it's crucial to find this. So we are embarked again on a quest for the one in the many. But now the whole quest is transferred to the world of forms. We are looking for the one supreme form uniting the many forms. Of course, Plato believed there was one such form, the ultimate axiom from which everything else follows, indeed from which, if you grasp it, you are truly omniscient, because you grasp all the other forms, and since this world is simply the reflection in space of the other world of forms, you would therefore, insofar as this world is intelligible at all, have understood everything there is to know about it. You would, in a world, have explained the total of existence on every level if you grasp this form. Plato's reality can therefore be analogically compared to a pyramid. And what we're looking for now is the apex, the climax, the jackpot, the ultimate key to reality. Now, of course, Plato gives no argument to prove that the supreme form must be single in nature, that there must be only one. On this point, he is simply reflecting the monism which was characteristic of most of Greek philosophy. It's another reflection of the Greek desire to reduce the many to the one, here, of course, in an otherworldly form. Well, what could the nature of this fundamental form be? Well, we know it is to explain the entire universe. It's to be the explanation of everything. That raises the question, what do you take as an explanation? And Plato has a firm answer to that question. Plato is a thorough teleologist. Now, you remember that I defined teleology as the view that purpose is operative somewhere in the universe, and perhaps in the universe as a whole. There are various forms of teleology. And it is contrasted with mechanism, the view that everything happens by mechanical law, devoid of purpose, a la the atomist viewpoint. Well, Plato is a teleologist, a universal teleologist. He believes that every event in the universe has to be explained in terms of the purpose it serves, in terms of something the events of the world are striving to accomplish, in terms of goals, of ends, of a good of some kind that everything is aiming at. Plato regards the atomists as completely wrong in their concept of what constitutes an explanation. The atomists, he says, at best tell us how things happen. They tell us that under these circumstances, this is the way the particles of matter jostle. These are the descriptive laws that characterize the actual behavior of the physical world. The atomists tell us how. They simply describe, says Plato. Then that's true of any mechanist, he says. If we want to know why and not just how, if we want explanation and not just description, it must be in terms of purpose. And purpose means some good that everything is aiming at. Now, on the human level, this is obvious. If Bobby Fischer makes a move at chess, no amount of mechanistic explanation will explain it. You can talk about the quivering of his cortex till you're blue in the face. You will not capture the reason he made that move as apart from his motive, the goal he was aiming at, namely to defeat Spassky. Now, Plato adopts this pattern of explanation for the entire universe. That, of course, is an unjustified overgeneralization, but he does it nevertheless. As he sees it, the alternative is atomistic mechanism across the board or teleology across the board, and he takes the latter. Consequently, he calls the ultimate form the form of the good, since the good is that which everything is aiming at. Of course, another word for it is goodness, and therefore the expression goodness gracious is pure Platonism. Now, what are the functions of the form of the good? It has two fundamental functions in Plato, one metaphysical, one epistemological. Metaphysically, it is the purpose of all of existence, the purpose of the universe. Epistemologically, it is the single axiom of all knowledge. Metaphysically, to restate, it is the source of existence. It's what makes all of reality possible. Now, on a teleological model of the universe, obviously, if you removed the purpose, you would remove everything which exists to serve the purpose. If Fisher did not have any purpose, he would not play the chess game. It couldn't exist. Well, similarly, if you hold that the entire universe exists to serve a purpose, if you remove the purpose, the whole universe would vanish. In that sense of the term, this form of the good for Plato is the source of all existence. And, of course, epistemologically, as a result, it is the source of all intelligibility. It's what makes anything understandable, because it's the thing which leads to the axioms of the sciences and all the way down. Short of reaching the form of the good intellectually, reality remains a mystery to us. We simply wouldn't understand why. Now, in this respect, the form of the good performs for Plato a function enormously similar to the function that God performed for later Christian philosophy, on both points. God for Christianity is the source of reality and the ultimate source of intelligibility. Until you grasp him, and in Christian terms, his plan, you simply cannot make any sense out of the universe. In this respect, Christianity took over entirely Plato's view. But Plato's form of the good is not yet itself a God. It is, remember, a universal, impersonal, unconscious. It is simply abstract, universal goodness. It has no plan, no will, no awareness. It just exists in the world of forms, and everything strives for it. To get God out of Plato's form of the good, you in effect have to do two things: drop an O and add a personality, which was very shortly done. Now, Plato himself compares the form of the good in an analogy only to the sun, that is S-U-N, not Jesus. Because he says the sun, in a certain sense, enables everything to exist on Earth. At least it enables living things to exist by providing the heat and the life sustenance that is required. Otherwise, the Earth would turn cold and die. And in that loose analogical sense, it enables the Earth to exist. And epistemologically, the sun makes everything visible. This is in the age prior to Thomas Edison. And without it, the whole world would be black, and no one could have any awareness of it. Well, in that same sense, the form of the good now has these two functions applied to the entire universe. Well, and if you ask me, what is it? If it is this vital, the most urgent philosophic question will be, what is the good? We have to know it to understand anything, to make the universe intelligible. Well, what is Plato's answer to the question, what is the nature of the good? What is the ultimate purpose of everything? Unfortunately, I can't tell you. I can't tell you because Plato held very strongly the view that his deepest thoughts should not be put in writing. He held that the form of the good is ineffable. Ineffable is a technical philosophic term, meaning outside the power of human conceptualization, beyond human language, logic, discussion, concepts. To grasp the form of the good, you do not do any intellectualizing. You must simply transcend the intellect and have an intuition or a vision. A vision which, when you have it, is completely blindingly self-illuminating, and which, if you don't have it, there is nothing anyone can say to you. To those who understand, no explanation is necessary. To those who do not understand, no explanation is possible, In either case, we don't explain. Now, this, of course, is mysticism, technical mysticism. Mysticism being the view that knowledge is obtainable by means other than reason or the senses. And in this respect, Plato is the father of Western mysticism in Western philosophy. You will see the extent of his following as the course proceeds if you don't already know it. Now, I should say that Plato himself believed that there was a definite course of action you should take to have this special vision. Although he couldn't tell you what the vision was like, he could tell you the necessary steps to attaining it. And he outlines them in detail. It amounts to a rigorous period of mathematical training, essentially mathematical stretching across decades and becoming progressively more abstract. Plato felt that mathematics was very valuable because the more you engage in higher mathematics, the more tenuous your tie to the physical world becomes, in his opinion. And at a certain point, you cut your ties altogether. And at that point, you are free to go on to the form of the good. And you see, of course, therefore, the mathematical influence of the Pythagorean mathematical mysticism on Plato. Well, to sum up then Plato's metaphysics, there is a world of forms presided over by the form of the good, all of it reflected into space, thereby generating this half-real reflection that we call the physical world, and if we're not Platonists, we mistakenly call it reality. Now let us turn more systematically to Plato's epistemology. If Plato's world of forms is immutable, and this world is a reflection created by the forms projecting themselves into this world, how can the forms be immutable? Isn't projection a type of motion? No. As he interprets it, projection is not a type of motion. In the same way as if you stood completely motionless, you would be projecting your image, but you wouldn't be moving. Now, of course, you'd answer me, but the light waves are moving. To which Plato says, yes, but that, after all, is just a metaphor. We cannot put into exact language the way in which the forms project themselves. All we can say is that some motionless process. I may say the Christians had exactly the same problem. God created the world, and God, they held on Platonic grounds, was completely motionless. How did he create the world if he couldn't do anything? And their answer was he did it the same way Plato's forms projected. And to grasp that, you have to go in the higher mysteries beyond the province of human reason. Do I regard Plato's metaphysics as being motivated primarily by his ethical viewpoint? Well, that is a question which I don't know the answer to, nor know that the answer would make any difference, and which I'm reluctant to speculate about. It's two entirely different questions. What does a philosopher say, and is it true or false, and what is his motive? Now, it's deuces wild with regard to their motives, unless they have written something which explicitly says that this is their motive. And it doesn't make any difference. Suppose Plato was motivated by a passion for the all-powerful state, or by a passion for truth as he saw it. In either case, he put forth the ideas he did for the reasons that he did, and they had the influence that they did. And so it's simply a question of your private, personal evaluation of Plato's character, which I don't see as having any philosophic significance at all. And therefore, I stay away altogether from questions of the motive of philosophers, unless we're specifically in a psychological and not a philosophical context, which is not the context of these lectures. Obviously, Plato was primarily concerned with value questions, or rather, he was passionately, I take out the primarily, he was passionately concerned with value questions. He thought that what had been done to Socrates was vicious and evil, and the death by hemlock, and that there was something fundamentally wrong with Athens, and that it had to be reorganized politically. He thought the sophists were depraved, but he was also fascinated by mathematics. He was fascinated by questions about the nature of the universe. And I'd defy anybody to say this interest was greater than this, and this is what gave rise to this. And as I say, I don't see the relevance of it. According to Plato, what is the status of mythical concepts? Concepts which have no actual embodiments in this world. Now, Santa Claus is a proper name, so that's not a concept. But suppose you say unicorn, or centaur, or something like that, which could have many instances. You see, an individual can't exist in the other world, only universals. What is their status? Yes, of course, their universals exist in the other world too. There is centaurhood and unicornness and all the rest of it. There's even square circlehood, according to many Platonists. On the grounds, you see, that we can think of those things. If we think of those things, they must be something. We can't think about what is not. And since they don't exist here, they must exist in Plato's world of forms. And therefore, yes. Now, Plato, in one of his dialogues, a late dialogue called the Parmenides, raised the question, what kinds of universals are there? He has Socrates as his mouthpiece. He was disturbed by the question because it seemed there had to be all kinds of universals that he didn't care to have in his perfect world. For instance, there had to be universals of evil. There had to be perfect rottenness, because rottenness is universal. And Plato was disturbed at the idea that there has to be all these corrupt things in their perfect form in the other world. But by the logic of his argument, they have to. Also, he didn't very much like the idea that there has to be universals of mud, universal dirt, universal toenails. And he has Socrates say at this point in the dialogue that he feels that he's being driven into absurdity, and yet he doesn't know what to do with it. And one of the speakers in the dialogue, Parmenides, of course, it isn't historically accurate because Parmenides was long dead, reassures Socrates, and he says that he's disturbed by those things only because he's still young. And when he grows older, the implication is he will accept with equanimity the complete assortment of things in the other world and not be disturbed by it. So Plato himself was in debate. But his followers made it all embracing. There are witches up there and fairies and everything. Well, technically, Plato's empty space is not matter, but an ingredient of matter. Matter is the union of empty space with the forms. However, you could look at it from this point of view. If you ask Plato what is the essence of matter, since he believes that all the secondary qualities, that is, the colors, sounds, taste, etc., are simply subjective in the same way that Democritus and the Atomists believe, all that's left for matter to have is the quantitative characteristics. Extension in 3 dimensions. And extension in 3 dimensions is precisely what space is. And therefore, it's very common for advocates of the Democritean view that matter is only quantitative to reduce matter to space and say that therefore out there in the real world there's only space. And you can find that in Plato, since he subscribes to that dichotomy. Now you see, that has the effect of dissolving the physical world altogether into nothing. And it's simply another reason why that dichotomy between the primary and secondary qualities is disastrous. But you can find it in Plato.